Sometimes I think people assume that as you get older, it gets easier to write, like if it's your fifth book or, sixth book, whatever. But my experience is it's not like that at all. It doesn't get any easier. So within that nebulous beginning, also there are valleys of anxiety, mountains of self-doubt. One week you feel like, I got this, I have an amazing story. And then the next week you're crawling on the floor because everything you've written previously, it's so bad. But all I learned over the years is that is part of the creative process.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Doug Johnstone, a novelist and Royal Literary Fund Fellow. And with me today, I'm absolutely thrilled to have Elif Shafak. Hi Elif, how are you doing?
Hi, it's so good to be here. Thank you.
Good stuff. If anyone doesn't know, Elif Shafak is a renowned Turkish-British author of 21 books, both novels and works of non-fiction. She's won or been shortlisted for dozens of prizes, too many to list, but they include a Booker Prize shortlisting in 2019, the Haldor Laxness International Literary Prize in 2021, the British Academy's President's Medal in 2024 for her overall body of work. And recently she won the Fiction with a Sense of Place Award, which is a great title, for her latest novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky. We'll be talking about that novel as we go on, amongst other things as well. But one of the subjects I wanted to talk to you about first is research and about doing and using research, because it feels to me that your novels are really, they use research really well. And with that in mind, we're going to listen to a first clip, which is an extract from a longer talk by novelist Bethan Roberts on researching and turning fact into fiction.
I used to worry that I didn't have enough imagination to be a writer, that it wasn't easy enough for me to jump down that hole. But I've thought a bit about it over the years, and this is what I think imagination is. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not about having the ability to conjure a story out of thin air, although hopefully that's how it will appear to your reader. It's about sensitivity to the world around you, about being able, focused, disciplined enough to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. It's about being, in other words, interested in a teacup, how it was made, what its shape and smell is, who held it last, and what they were longing for as they drank their tea. In other words, imagination comes from the solid world around us. So I think a really good idea, if you want to write fiction, is to find out as much as possible about things that you are passionate about. This process is what some people call research. I wish there was another term, actually, one that was specific to writers. Research feels too academic, and Hilary Mantel, twice Booker winner, writing genius, the gold standard among historical novelists, doesn't like us mere mortals to use it. In her wonderful Wreath lectures for the BBC, she said, writers shouldn't claim they are doing research when they mean they are skimming facts out of pre-existing texts. Well, perhaps not. It does sound a bit highfalutin. But whatever we want to call it, I find that research or finding out or investigation is a good way for me to build up to writing something. It's a period which allows me time to read, daydream, create characters, events, locations. In other words, research is my imaginative hole under the bed. And for me, this hole has often led to writing about the real lives of people in the public eye. There's a long and rich tradition of turning this kind of fact into fiction, stretching from Shakespeare's history plays to Walter Scott's romances, to the many based upon a true story novels of today. Joyce Carol Oates' Blonde about Marilyn Monroe and Michael Cunningham's The Hours about Virginia Woolf's are two of my favourites. In these works, the writer inhabits the gaps in the known stories of real people, imagining what it might have been like to be them in all sorts of ordinary, extraordinary situations.
So that was really fascinating. I don't know if anything that Bethan said was chiming with you, Elif, in terms of your attitude to research.
Definitely chiming with me. So much of what she said resonates with me, very close to my heart. Maybe I could tell you right away that for me, writing fiction is not necessarily autobiographical. I have a lot of respect for autobiographical work, But personally, my journey has been slightly different. I think I like to think of fiction as more transcendental. What do I mean by that? We're all born into a little corner of the universe. We're all born into a particular identity. What intrigued me and interested me from a very early age onwards was what is the world like beyond that box?
Sure.
How do I travel beyond those borders that are drawn in front of me? So for me, literature is very, very fluid. I think, broadly speaking, there are two ways of writing a novel. One is a bit more like mathematical, cerebral, in which the author wants to know how the characters are going to behave in the next 15 chapters, how the story is going to end. Perhaps a little bit more like engineering. And once again, I respect that path deeply, but it's not my path.
Okay.
I like the second path in which the author is a little bit drunk. You do not know what you're doing, but you have a strong intuition.
Okay.
So there's some irrational element going on, and you have to just allow your imagination fly. Let the characters surprise you. Just let that river flow. However, for me to feel that kind of confidence and jump into that ether, I have to do my research well, right? So what do I mean by research? I genuinely believe writers need to be two things all our lives. We need to be good readers and good listeners. When I say reading, not only the same type of books, the same type of genres, but across the board, fiction and non-fiction, just to keep the curiosity of the mind alive. Anything and everything that speaks to us is the right book for us in that moment. So I've never believed in that distinction between highbrow literature, lowbrow literature.
Yeah, sure.
So from cookbooks to political philosophy to history, let's keep reading, let's keep learning, let's be students of life. But then also we learn a lot and unlearn a lot, because sometimes there are stereotypes that we need to unlearn by listening to people. So if this is research, I really value that. And I love interdisciplinary conversations and journeys.
Yeah, and it strikes me that one of the things that Bethan mentioned there was about finding out as much as you can about something you're passionate about. So that feels to me like, say, for example, in There Are Rivers in the Sky, it's a very passionate book. It's about lots of different things. But I'm wondering how it sounds like you're just doing it almost totally instinctively, just reading stuff that you're interested in. I mean, the history of water or Victorian London or ancient Assyria and all sorts of things in between. So I wonder at what stage, I mean, it must be quite nebulous to start off with. How do you know, or do you know when it's time to start writing or when it's going to coalesce into something?
Yeah, nebulous is such a lovely word, isn't it? And it describes the journey beautifully. And sometimes I think people assume that as you get older, it gets easier to write, like if it's your fifth book or, sixth book, whatever. But my experience is it's not like that at all. It doesn't get any easier. So within that nebulous beginning, also there are values of anxiety, mountains of self-doubt. One week you feel like, I got this, I have an amazing story. And then the next week you're crawling on the floor because everything you've written previously, it's so bad. But all I learned over the years is that is part of the creative process. I liked what you pointed out kindly. I love learning from different disciplines, wherever my curiosity takes me. And I think the mind is always more nourished when we dare to leave our comfort zones. As a novelist, I don't know anything about neuroscience, but I want to learn, like this childish curiosity. We have to be, that's why, students of life all the time, or about physics or about water science. It always intrigues me when, for instance, a novelist becomes interested in chemistry, or a scientist becomes interested in poetry, a film director becomes infatuated with philosophy. Those are the conversations that I find very, very nurturing and nourishing.
Yeah, but you also, I think the trick is, with your fiction, that you wear it very lightly. So, I mean, we've all read novels, perhaps, where it's very clear that the author's done a lot of research and they want you to know about it. Here's everything I know, and it feels like a bit of an information dump. But that's not the case for you at all. It feels like it's seamlessly part of the characters and part of the story. And I wonder if you do you write a lot more and then cut it out, or do you let it settle a little bit in your mind before you start? How does it work for you?
Yeah, I so appreciate this question. It really is important to me. You filter it through, don't you? I mean, through your experience, your character, your own dreams, your own fears. So it's not like you take research and just put it into a novel. Not at all. There's an alchemy there. It turns into something completely different. For me, literature is a bridge builder, and I would like to think of it as connecting the dots, between different cultures, different places. But also, I would love my fiction to the best of my ability to be a bridge builder between written culture and oral culture. I'm very attached to the European tradition of the novel, but this is not the only type of storytelling that I have known or I grew up with. So I also feel very attached to the oral storytelling traditions of the Balkans, the Mediterranean, the Levant, the Middle East, Asia Minor, which is a bit more cyclical, more circular. So I think you combine all these different ways of storytelling in your soul, in your character. Otherwise, you can't write. It has to come from within. It has to be organic, and I think that's the only way.
And one of the things that Bethan was talking about there was about fictionalising real-life characters or real-life situations. And you do that, of course, in There Are Rivers in the Sky with the character of Arthur Smith. And if you could just, this is set in Victorian London, his thread of the narrative. And I wondered how much, because it's based on a real person, but you've obviously fictionalised him as well. And I wondered, did you have any concerns about that balance, or did you feel a kind of free rein to just go ahead and do whatever you wanted with his real life facts?
Well, there are always concerns, always those anxieties are there, but there has to be something else, and that's something else I call love. If there's a genuine love, it might sound weird for a novelist to say this, but I really fell in love with this character. Of course, my character is completely fictional and loosely based on this actual historical figure. But I was very interested in him. I dreamed up a childhood, youth for him. Very briefly, maybe summarizing, he's born into the slum tenements of Chelsea at the time, into severe poverty. Had he been alive today, I think we would have recognized the beauty of his mind, the neurodivergence of his mind, and respected that very much. But of course, at the time, he gets no recognition or support.
Sure.
And purely by the power of his visual memory, by coincidence, he comes to British Museum, and then he starts piecing together these broken, shattered tablets, decoding the flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And he's buried, actually, because he wanted to find the missing lines in a poem. He's buried in a forgotten graveyard between Turkey and Syria. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are so many silences. Just like the missing lines he wanted to find, there are missing lines in his story.
Yeah.
And as a storyteller, I'm not only interested in stories, I'm always drawn to silences. And people who have been silenced, forgotten, those buried truths, buried rivers, I'm very interested in them.
And one thing I wondered about as well is that you have an academic background as well. And I wondered if, so do a lot of writers, but I wonder if that feeds into this idea of research. Because like Bethan was talking about, it feels like there should be a different word for it for novelists compared to, say, academics, because it feels like a different thing. I kind of grew up with a kind of feeling you have to know. You have to be an expert about the thing you're writing about, otherwise, you get imposter syndrome. I wonder if your academic background fed into your attitude towards research.
I think it has, especially the fact that I try to have a more interdisciplinary academic background. I haven't stayed in one field, but I was very curious about multiple fields. Also, I've studied women's studies, and that was a very, very interdisciplinary field. Like you learn from history, you learn from sociology, political science. But I guess I like it when the mind is a bit more nomadic. You are absolutely right. We need another word. Maybe research is not that word. We're all looking for that word. Maybe we'll find it, by the end of this podcast.
Let's do it.
But I think what we all like is learning and not be afraid of saying, I don't know. We live in an age in which we have forgotten to say, I don't know. And I find that very problematic. I don't know was the beginning of philosophy. It was the beginning for Socrates, for pre-Socrates. Socratic philosophers. So when you say I don't know, you're also saying I'm ready to learn. You know, I'm embarking on this journey.
Sure.
I do make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom.
Okay.
So I'm not interested in information. Hopefully, let's be more interested in knowledge and wisdom. I think we're living in an age in which we're bombarded by morsels and snippets of information. And the truth is we cannot process this much information. Yeah. And also it makes us arrogant. It gives us the illusion that we know something about everything, you know? But if we go back to knowledge, I think for knowledge we need podcasts, we need slow journalism, we need books, cultural spaces, literary festivals, and then hopefully for wisdom, there has to be an additional element, which is emotional intelligence. You know, it's not all about knowledge or books. Something else has to speak up, and that is the heart, that is the emotions. So I find that very important too.
Yeah, I have a feeling that a lot of my novels stem from this idea that I'm writing about the subjects to find out about them, to find out what I think about it.
Yeah.
Because if you don't write about it, how can you find out what you think about it? I think it's really common for a lot of writers. Well, another thing I want to talk to you about is structure. I think a lot of your books are structured very interestingly. You've already touched a little bit on different histories of novels and histories of storytelling. So we're going to listen to a second clip just now. It's an extract from a longer talk by TV scriptwriter David Lloyd on something that might be a little bit different from what we've done, but it's on writing within strict structures.
Since it was launched back in 2000, I've written over 60 episodes of the BBC drama series Doctors, as well as several episodes of EastEnders and Casualty. Unlike many other continuing drama series where storylines are largely generated in-house, Doctors gives the writer an opportunity to create and pitch their own story of the day. The story of the day features guest actors and needs to start and finish during the episode. There are constraints on how you can tell this story. It can't feature more than 3 guest characters, all the action needs to be completed within a calendar day, and one of the main Doctors cast needs to be involved as a catalyst. My first task is to come up with an idea for an original story of the day. This could be triggered by a single character, an inciting incident, a medical dilemma, or a simple encounter between 2 people. In order to get underneath the skin of my characters and come up with stories that have emotional depth, I've mined my personal life and family very deeply over the years. My first ever episode was an account of my late wife's attempts to get our GP to prescribe cannabis to alleviate the pain and muscle spasm caused by her multiple sclerosis. Another was devoted to my 2 recently deceased grandmothers. Both stories had extra depth because I understood the characters so well. Once the story of the day has been commissioned, I have something like a 70% hit rate, I'm allocated a particular episode and given the serial stories that are running through the series, usually 2, sometimes 3. I'll be given a starting and finishing point to those stories and several key milestones that need to be hit during the episode, as well as the serial hook that will close the show. It's then my job to find resonance across the stories and produce an episode where everything comes together to produce a satisfying whole. When I started writing for Doctors, I viewed my story of the day as the main event. The serial stories were a minor inconvenience that got in the way of what would be my brilliantly well-crafted and potentially BAFTA award-winning piece of original drama. Experience has taught me that it is, of course, the ongoing stories concerning the personal lives of the main characters that keep the viewers tuning in on a daily basis. I quickly learned to give all stories equal weight, and my episodes became much stronger as a result. By its very nature, writing for a continuing drama series is a collegiate effort. Although the scripts carry my name, the contribution of my script editor, researchers, the producer and executive producer all play an important part in the creative process. Before I can write the first draft of my script, we all need to agree on the story we are trying to tell. The first stage in this process is for me to produce a scene-by-scene breakdown of the entire episode, showing exactly how the story will unfold. Typically, an episode of Doctors will be around 6,500 words across 55 pages, divided into approximately 30 scenes. A good scene-by-scene can be almost as long as the final script itself. My latest ran to 5,800 words. Each scene heading will tell the reader where the action takes place and who is in the scene. I then detail everything that will happen, including key pieces of dialogue. The final product is not too dissimilar to an essay plan. An analogy I found very useful in my work as an RLF writing fellow. Once the scene-by-scene is finished, I usually have a week to do this, I send it to my script editor, who will share it with the producer and researcher. When we are all happy that we're telling our stories in the right order, I then have another week to write my first draft. This is where good planning pays off. If I've structured my narrative well, then everything has a logical flow that heads inexorably towards the episode hook. I still have to tell the story in as elegant a way as possible, with effective dialogue and action, but it means I shouldn't have to spend too much time gazing into space while asking myself, what happens next?
Well, as far as I know, neither of us have written episodes of Doctors. That was kind of mildly terrifying, I thought, in the terms of he's talking about how prescriptive it was in structure. How did you feel about that?
It is a bit terrifying, isn't it? And I was very curious about his process, his writing process, how structured it is, and understandably, I mean, it has a different pace, rhythm, and you work with different people. But when you're a novelist, I think the energy is completely different.
Yeah.
There's so much solitude. Walter Benjamin called the life of a novelist the loneliest of arts, you know.
Yeah.
So we have to keep our own inner garden alive, and most of the energy that we need comes from within. But that said, I think there's so much also that resonates with me in what he said about structure, you know, planning. These things are also important. Every story brings its own style and brings its own structure. For instance, one of my earlier novels is called 10 Minutes, 38 Seconds in the Strange World. It tells the life of a sex worker in Istanbul. And right away we know, on the very first page actually, that she's dead, meaning her heart has stopped beating, but her brain is still alive for a few more minutes. So that gave me the entire structure for the book. That it was the story that dictated the structure. And then I had to count the minutes backwards until the point when she dies and she's buried in the cemetery of the Companions, where many outcasts in Turkey or in Istanbul are buried. So all I'm trying to say is I like it when the story demands its own structure rather than having one structure in my mind for it.
Yeah, but it must be, I mean, you're quite diverse, the different kinds of structures. It obviously ties in with exactly what you said. But I wonder, because for quite a long time, I think I was writing very similarly structured books, and I'm kind of diversed from that a little bit. But I wonder, you're saying that the structure is dictated by the story, but at what point do you know that? So something for like, There Are Rivers in the Sky, you know, you have three interlinking narratives linked by a drop of water, effectively, over thousands of years. Did that come really quickly, or was that a kind of eureka moment, or was it kind of a slow realization that's what it had to be?
I think it's a slow realization, and you need to, you know, go step by step. So even though, for instance, There Are Rivers in the Sky might look like an epic novel in the sense that it does span centuries and continents and cultures, actually everything came to me via that tiny little drop of water, just the raindrop that landed on my palm, on my hand. That took me to the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh took me to George Smith. But the interesting thing for me was, as you know, in this novel, there are three characters who seem to be completely different at first glance, but are connected. So hopefully they're connected in a surprising way. What I found out as I was writing was each character demanded a different style and almost a structure. So the Victorian element is written in a much more Dickensian way, if I may call it as such, whereas the modern character, much more contemporary fiction. And when you come to the third character, her name is Nareen. She lives in Turkey. She's from the Yazidi minority, in which oral culture is so important and dominant. So that part is mostly written via dialogues. And I like it when characters also demand their own styles and structures.
Yeah, and one of the interesting thing that David mentioned in that talk about Doctors is he said that he learned to give all stories equal weight, which I loved actually, because it doesn't matter if you're writing an episode of television or a novel or anything, is that it took me a while to learn this, but actually you're thinking about all the characters. And so in those instances where you have very disparate or seemingly different characters at the start, it doesn't feel, because sometimes you read a book where you're skipping past one bit, if it's a historical part, to get to the modern day one, but it never feels like that. It feels like you are dedicating equal time to these characters? These are equally as important to you in the story?
Yeah, 100%. And when David was saying that, I was nodding my head. It is so important that we give equal weight, equal love to all the characters. If you don't do that, actually, the reader will sense it immediately, and I don't think it will work in the end. We're weaving all these different threads, but it is a challenge, to be honest, because as a writer, you have to journey into the soul and mind of each and every character. And some of these characters might be nasty characters. They don't necessarily need to be likable characters. But I think empathy, I like the German, when I think of I do not speak German, but when I look at the etymology of the word empathy, it's more like journey into someone else's psyche.
Yeah.
And that's what we try to do when we're writing novels, don't we?
Yeah. And one of the things you mentioned earlier actually was about different, sort of coming from different traditions of the novel or storytelling, so the Western and also Turkish and Eastern. And it strikes me that there's definitely elements of other things going on in your writing. It felt sometimes like elements of fairy tale or myth. That seems to be very important to you. And that kind of lends a kind of resonance to the stories because it's a kind of storytelling that's gone back thousands of years, effectively. Is that a conscious thing on your part, or is it just that's how it comes out?
I think that's how it comes out because of who I am, my own upbringing.
Okay.
I was raised by a grandmother, a traditional grandmother, until I was 10 years old. And she was a bit of a storyteller herself. My grandma was not a very well-educated woman, only because she had been pulled out of school for being a girl in Turkey at the time. And she wholeheartedly believed in women's education and independence. And I think by observing her, I realized that there are different paths to knowledge. Like you might not have a fancy diploma on the wall, but you can still be a very wise person.
Sure.
She was a wise person, I think. But on the other hand, you might graduate from a very well-known university or college, and you can still be ignorant, actually, in life. So there are different paths to not only knowledge, also to wisdom. And when I look at oral culture, which is unfortunately sometimes belittled or pushed away as the domain of irrationality or superstitions, but there's something underneath. Even our superstitions are the projections of our deepest fears. They come from somewhere. And especially in a country like Turkey, where written culture has conveniently forgotten so much of our past, sometimes you find those lost memories in oral culture.
Yeah.
If you speak to the elderly, they will tell you the things that history textbooks have erased and buried. So there's a lot of knowledge in that world. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing I really want to talk about with you, without getting too existential and philosophical, is deep time. I want to talk about time. And to get us in the mood for it, to get us warmed up, we're going to listen to a little clip from art historian and novelist Elif Shafak on the future of literature.
Whenever I think of the future in the grand sense, not in relation to my personal life, I'm reminded of the past. More particularly, a memorable failed attempt to imagine a future world that I came across when I was a child in Yorkshire in the late 70s. On the shelf there were, for some reason, volumes of the Strand magazine from the 1890s, bound handsomely in turquoise and gold. I was drawn to them by the Sherlock Holmes stories that had appeared for the first time in their pages. But at the end of one copy, of 1893, I found a series of fascinating drawings of future fashions, sketches of what Victorians thought that people would be wearing a century on in 1993. These were plain weird. They imagined that men and women of the late 20th century would be dressed in elaborate frilled costumes with huge and peculiar hats that looked like the cod medieval outfits worn by contestants on the late and unlamented TV programme It's a Knockout. When it comes to the future of literature as it's been imagined in recent years, these imaginings often have the same mixture of weirdness and wrongness as I saw in the Strand magazine. The assumption of the death of literature often seems to underpin visions of the future. No one is ever shown reading on a spaceship or an alien planet, apart from strictly for practical reasons, and the sets of science fiction films and television shows often don't feature books at all. From the Starship Enterprise to Star Wars, it's wall-to-wall screens with not a bookshelf in sight. When books do appear in future homes, they're usually part of a dystopian vision. Think of Alex invading the house of the writer and his wife in Stanley Kubrick's 1971 film version of Anthony Burgess's 1962 novel, A Clockwork Orange. The literary man is beaten and his wife brutally raped in a room furnished with a wall of books. They seem to represent literature as the past, enfeebled, pitiful, and no match for our violent, vital anti-hero. Rick Deckard's apartment in the film Blade Runner, made in 1982 but set in 2019, has untidy piles of old books, but Deckard is a renegade, and the director Ridley Scott intended us to realise at the end of the film that he is not human, he is a replicant. And yet, life as we live it in 2017 is full of literature, full of books. We can read them on a screen, yes, but the printed form still prevails. There are still shops exclusively devoted to books, new and second-hand. We create groups to discuss them virtually and face-to-face. Apparently there are now 60 million IKEA Billy bookshelves in the world. All the signs are, then, that there will be a literature of the future, that future humans will continue to write and to read. But as to what form the stories, the poems, the non-fiction of the future will take, I remember the Strand magazine, and also writer William Goldman's famous quote. He was talking about writing for film in his wonderful Adventures in the Screen Trade of 1983, but I think what he said applies just as much to literature in general. Nobody knows anything.
Well, Elif, I'm not expecting us to come up with the future of literature right here and now. Did anything about that resonate with you, thinking about the future?
Hugely, it resonated with me. I loved her analysis. And I remembered how there were so many assumptions throughout 1980s, 1990s that the novel was going to die.
Yeah.
This was the death of the novel.
It's died a lot of times, hasn't it?
It has died so many times, right? It's a zombie art. And the assumption back then was, well, this is the age of fast consumption. Nobody's going to have time, shortening attention spans. Of course, there's a kernel of truth in that. But I think the faster our world runs, and the more we're bombarded by these morsels of information that we talked about, the deeper our need to slow down and to go back to this ancient and universal art, the art of storytelling, which has always been there. I think when I was writing this novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky, it gave me a chance to maybe think about this more carefully. Because imagine, the Epic of Gilgamesh was transmitted orally for such a long time, grandmothers to grandchildren, before it was written down on clay tablets. So actually it's much, much older than we know. And then I was thinking, ever since it was put inside the library of Ashurbanipal, this mighty king, strong man, whatever, so many empires have come and gone. So many cruel and cold rulers have perished. Even the strongest or tallest monuments have crumbled to dust. But a poem made of words and made of breath has survived the tides of history. Yeah. And here we are, thousands of years later, still talking about it, still learning from it. So I think literature has a very gentle, quiet but profound power, and that will be with us hopefully for a long, long time.
Yeah, and I think especially in that most recent book, because there's an element about the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's this idea, just like you talked about a continuity of humanity and of storytelling through the years and the centuries and the millennia, that I think it's a hard thing to grasp generally, but I think that the novel is one of the best ways of doing it because it's a long form of writing. I mean, I've heard you mention before in interviews about, because social media is all short-termism and, short attention spans, that the only place really left for a nuanced discussion of a subject is in a novel.
100%. I was thinking about the question as to who tells the story of the past, who owns cultural artifacts, for instance. Let's take this question. It is a very important, universal question, and people can easily get angry over this question. Social media is not the right place to ask this question. I think it's a conversation that museums across the world need to get engaged in.
Mm-hmm.
They cannot stay away from this conversation. But in an interesting way, maybe a novel is the right place to discuss this. Because in a novel, as you pointed out, there's room for nuance. There's room for multiple thoughts, a pluralism of ideas. And I don't think a writer's job is to try to give the answers. I don't like it when writers try to dictate or preach or teach. I don't know the answers.
Yeah.
All I know is I care about the questions. And so you create an open space of nuance and you leave the answers to the reader. In this novel, what I saw was you can have genuine appreciation for someone like George Smith, for his passion as a scholar. Mm-hmm. At the same time, you can be critical of colonial institutional history. How come these artifacts ended up in the British Museum or the Louvre or the Metropolitan, for instance?
Yeah.
But at the same time, ask other questions about, for instance, what were the Ottoman authorities doing in the meantime? In Turkey, we never ask this question.
Yeah.
Or another layer is how ISIS destroyed cultural artifacts in both Syria and Iraq. What I'm trying to say is this is a very complicated discussion, and literature is the right place to open it up. It's definitely not social media.
For sure. You wrote very eloquently recently in your Substack. By the way, listeners, I would highly recommend Elif's Substack. Every Sunday you get a beautiful little essay about all sorts of different things. But about time, you talked about Chronos and Kairos, am I saying it right?
Yes,
Kairos? Which is a different kind of time, like a more spiritual and perhaps malleable, less linear version of time. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Because we're all in the West, we all kind of feel like we're always clock watching and thinking of Chronos and the seconds and the minutes. Yeah. But this idea of Kairos is a completely different idea of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate this question. We're always guided by Chronos, aren't we? Like constantly the chronology, that's where the word chronology comes from, this clock time ticking. We also tend to think of time as a linear arc or as a linear journey. We tend to think that the arc of history will bend towards justice, that tomorrow is going to be more progressive than yesterday, and so on. So we have this linear, progressive idea of time. But I think that's an illusion. That's a creation of the mind. When we pay attention to nature, for instance, to a tree, a river, a mountain, then we start to question, and time might seem much more cyclical. There's no guarantee that tomorrow is going to be more progressive than yesterday. Sometimes countries can go backwards, actually. Sure. Sometimes generations can make the same mistakes or similar mistakes as to the ones that their great-grandparents might have made. If I may give an example, when you look at the River Thames, this is a zombie river, isn't it? Because not that long ago, it was declared biologically dead because of the way we human beings mistreated the river, filled it with waste and sewage. And yet the Thames is a miracle. It managed to renew itself, recreate itself. How fascinating is that? Today it is home to more than 200 biospecies. And yet, as we're speaking right now, again, water companies, in the name of money and profit, they're pumping waste and sewage back into the river. So when you follow the journey of one river, one tree, time doesn't feel linear. It feels more cyclical. I do believe that story time is much more closer to the long, deep time, Kairos. And I think writers are always drawn to the deep time.
Yeah, definitely. One other thing I want to talk to you about in terms of time is something I'm kind of low-key obsessed about, is the Future Library.
Yes.
So this is a project by an artist called Katie Patterson, a Scottish artist, where she's going to get 100 authors to submit novels which won't be read for 100 years. So you've got a book in the Future Library called The Last Taboo, which no one's read and no one knows anything about. I'm not going to ask you about plot details, but how did you feel? How did that come about? Did they just get in touch with you? And how did it feel when you got this idea of writing a book that no one's going to read for 100 years, but then they're going to produce the books?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful project, such an inspiring idea. Katie Patterson developed this idea, and also there's a wonderful woman in Norway called Ann Beate. And I was very, very honored and very happy when I learned that I was chosen, because every year they choose one author from a different part
it's
of
like
the world.
It's like a who's like Margaret Atwood, David Mitchell, Han Krang. So it's
Indeed. And then there's a ceremony. They're also planting trees, and there's a forest that's growing alongside this library. I recently visited Oslo when There Are Rivers in the Sky was published in Norwegian, and I went to the library. It's so beautiful. So upstairs, it's almost like a library within a library. You go, and in this room, there are all these manuscripts in their glass cases. It almost feels, definitely it's a literary space or an intellectual space, but it almost feels like a spiritual space, you know? And you sit there and you think about, what will it mean to people? Will it mean anything to people 100 years from now? All these stories that we've written, it feels like, you know, you write something, you put it in a bottle, like a letter, and you leave it to the river, and the river of time takes it to someone, and you hope that it will reach its own audience.
Yeah, it's like a project of hope, isn't it? It's assuming there will be readers and books in 100 years.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to Norway for my holidays in the summer, so I'm definitely going to be checking out the Future Library. I'm going to go. Another thing that really infuses a lot of your work, probably all of it, I think, are ideas of social justice and social inequality. And there's definitely a political edge, probably with a small p, in all of your writing. And so we're going to listen to a little clip now from novelist Mirza Waheed. And he's talking about how the seeds of his first novel, The Collaborator, were planted by the brutality he witnessed as a teenager during government crackdowns in Kashmir.
In one of these crackdowns, we were in this in Srinagar, where I grew up, where my parents still live. It's about a 10-minute walk from the famous Dal Lake. And on the shores of this part of the lake, on the shores, is a old British era hospital, which was built by British missionaries. It's a hospital for leprosy patients. Yeah, and it was obviously built at a picturesque place, you know, to have nice air and nice looking. So it's on the shores of the lake, and it slopes down. The grounds of this hospital slope down into the lake. It has trees. It has, you know, barrack-style wards from that era, and we were rounded up in this in the grounds of this hospital by the lake. As I remember, as we walked in, I saw bodies lying, you know, somewhere not very far from where you were. But you can't walk. You can't pose. You have to walk in a file. You can't do anything about it. But I was, obviously, as a teenager, you were curious what's happened. You know, there's these bodies. And I remember watching these bodies. And some of them were dead, and I just said one of them wasn't dead. And as we walked, I think he asked for water, one of the body. You know, his lips moved. But in the next hour or so, or in a few hours, it was a long time ago. You know, I can't recall exactly how long time. There was no movement in these bodies. And then they were just hurled into a truck at some point and taken away, like literally discarded logs of wood, is how I described them at some point. And now this was both extraordinary and ordinary, because it happened everywhere in Kashmir. It wasn't my particular misfortune. This was every day. Every locality, in cities, in towns, in villages, in the countryside, there would be these operations launched by the Indian Army. And they were brutal. They were dehumanizing, you know, humiliating experiences. And this one siege lasted 3 days. Every day we had to get up, go to this ground, spend the day there, doing nothing, sitting, you know, uncomfortable, you know, or young and old. This was only one of the many, many experiences. There were also massacres. And I remember I went because you're a boy, you're this, you know, as I said, I wasn't someone who stayed home all the time, you know. It was a bit naughty. And I remember going the next day and I saw this mound of slippers, of this abandoned on the street. And those were people who had been killed the previous day. So all those things, you know, so you think it's not extraordinary, it's not profound because it's so everyday. And yet it is profound.
Wow, so that was quite distressing, really. But one of the things I think it highlights, the reason why we want to listen to that is, I mean, it's very powerful, but he is talking about how things are extraordinary but also ordinary in these kind of hideous, like, genocides and massacres and things that can happen. It's something that you have not been shy about addressing in your work as well, you know, in all sorts of different ways. And I wondered why in the first place you'd felt drawn to writing about these things, because they are quite distressing.
It was it was so powerful. I come from a country that has a very long and rich history, Turkey, but that doesn't necessarily translate into strong memory. If anything, I think we're a society of collective amnesia. The way history is taught to us is mostly his story, meaning the story of a few sultans or men in positions of power. But the moment you start asking, what was the past like, or the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century like, for women, for a concubine in the harem, for a prostitute in a brothel, or a peasant woman who had no access to power, or any young man who was not wealthy, or an Armenian silversmith, or a Jewish miller, or a Kurdish peasant, an Arab farmer, a Greek sailor, because these were the minorities at the time in the empire, then there's a big, big silence. I've always believed that if you happen to be a storyteller from such complicated lands and wounded democracies, you have to pay attention to silences. You have to pay attention to the periphery. It's a bit like being a linguistic or cultural archaeologist. You need to dig deep through layers of stories and silences.
Like find out whose stories are not being told or who are not getting the light of day.
Absolutely. So I think that's a big part of my work. But that said, I like the novel as a democratic space of nuance. As we mentioned earlier, I'm not trying to give any answers. It's the questions that I'm interested in. I want to be able to talk about silences and taboos. And sometimes this gets you into trouble in Turkey. It is difficult to be a novelist in Turkey, and to be a female novelist sometimes is even harder. There are so many layers that you need to deal with. In 2006, I wrote a novel called The Bastard of Istanbul, and I was put on trial for writing a work of fiction. I was accused of insulting Turkishness. That novel dealt with the past. It dealt with memory and amnesia, and it talked about the Armenian genocide. Years later, again, 2 of my books were investigated by a prosecutor who was looking for crime of obscenity, quote unquote, because this time I was dealing with, one of them was The Life of a Sex Worker, 10 minutes, 38 seconds. The other one, a novel called The Gaze, because they talked about gender violence, femicides, child brides, which I think means child abuse in its essence. So these are the realities of the land where I come from. And for me, it's very ironic that instead of helping the victims of abuse, instead of opening shelters or changing the laws, that the authorities can go after fiction writers or poets is quite paradoxical. But I guess my point is, when you come from such backgrounds, you cannot be apolitical. That doesn't mean I like partisan politics. I do not. I don't even like party politics much. But politics in a feminist way, I use the word politics. And I've learned as a feminist many wonderful things from past generations of women's movement. Of course, one of them being the personal is also political. So we might be writing about marriage, divorce, sexuality. That work can also be quite political.
And I guess that's gone on through all your work. There's a kind of beautiful open-mindedness to the stories. It deals with all these kind of things that can be quite shocking, but also it has wonderfully evocative and fully rounded characters from what might be considered minorities in their case, and it feels like it's giving a voice to these people. But I wonder, when you're talking about as a writer in Turkey and having this kind of aggressive stance from the powers that be against you, it must take a lot of resilience to get back on the saddle every time and sort of go, well, I'm going to write another book and there's going to be some other nonsense about it as when it comes out. How do you cope with that? Where do you get the inner strength?
Yeah, I don't know if it's resilience. The only thing I know is I love the art of storytelling, and that love is stronger than my worries and anxieties. And I am full of worries and anxieties, in my daily life. But when I'm writing a novel, I try to stay in that imaginary zone for as long as I can, as deep as I can. And those fictional characters become my companions. That world becomes my world. And I do not think about, what will the readers say if they read when they read this book, or what will the authorities say? Will I be sued or put on trial? If I were to start thinking that way, I couldn't write anything. So while I'm writing, I'm just thinking about my own imaginary world. Only when the book is done and I hand it to my editor, then I start having panic attacks and anxiety attacks. But by then it's too late. The book is born. It's independent of me. It has its own life and journey the way it should be. If I may add very quickly, I think writers are the memory keepers of their times. Memory keeping is important, not in order to be stuck in the past, but to learn from the past. Hopefully never ever to make the same mistakes. To heal, for individual and collective healing, I think memory is so important. I've observed so many immigrant families on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's so interesting. The elderly usually are the ones who have experienced the biggest hardships, but they do not talk about the past. Yeah. They don't even know how to talk about the past, but it sits inside their chest, unspoken. The second generation usually wants to build a new life, tabula rasa. They need to be forward-looking, future-oriented. They don't have the energy or the time for the past. But that leaves the third or fourth generations in these families, the youngest in these families, who are asking perhaps the biggest questions about ancestral heritage, not only family stories, but also family silences. So I find it interesting that in every family there's at least one memory keeper, and I'd like to believe that novelists are the memory keepers of their own societies.
Yeah, put that on your CV now, memory keeper.
Memory keeper.
Yeah, you've also written about a lot of this stuff, or certainly in a lot of your non-fiction. You had a book a few years ago, a beautiful little book called How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division, which is really lovely. But I get the feeling that you maybe feel more at home doing it in a novel because it's less direct in a way, that you're exposing yourself slightly less and you can come at things at a different angle.
Fiction is where my heart beats, 100%. I mean, I love nonfiction, I love essays, I love different disciplines, but everything flows back to fiction for me, because inside fiction, there's everything. Anything that's part of life can be part of a novel. Sometimes male readers above a certain age, they say, they come with good intentions. They say, so much is happening in the world, so I'm reading about important things. I read about finance and history and politics and neuroscience or technology. And then almost apologetically they say, but my wife reads fiction. My girlfriend reads fiction. Not young men. Young men don't do this. Many young men are reading novels today, which is fantastic. Yeah. But when I hear such comments, I feel really sad, because I think inside a novel there is politics, there is history, there is neuroscience or technology or philosophy, but perhaps more importantly, there's emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single human being who does not need to connect with their emotions, whether we're dentists, designers, students, or politicians, especially in this age in which we are guided and misguided. Politics is affected by emotions. So there's empathy, there's emotional intelligence inside a novel. And I guess what I'm trying to say is the word fiction can be a bit misleading in the English language, because we use it as if it were the opposite of reality. But actually, fiction brings us closer to truth.
Yeah. I mean, there are plenty of politicians, I think, who could do with reading more novels.
Definitely.
So the last thing I really want to talk to you about, we've talked a little bit about silence in one aspect, but I want to talk about music as well. And so we're going to have a little clip from poet Julian Turner, who's talking about the ambivalent quality of silence and how it relates to writing and productivity.
I can be in a room full of people and write, so sitting in a cafe is not too bad, because you're kind of on your own in the middle of a group of people, and it's not like you have to interact then with anyone, but you do need to be able to tune into your own wavelength. So I've heard people talk about, this idea of the third eye, that's saying that in the presence of another, the third eye is always closed, which does sound really nuts, but actually there is some truth in it, that we can only imagine when we're on our own, really. And ordinary everyday life is a bit of an interference with that. There's different sorts of silence. Often, poets and writers will talk about silence as being a positive virtue. And I can really see why that would be the case for them. But that's not true for everyone. There are some sorts of silence that are forced upon people, where the words have been taken away from people before they've had a chance to use them. Different sorts of coercion and tyranny require different sorts of silencing mechanisms and methods. So I always am cautious about talking about silence, because I think that there's different sorts, and some can be productive and some just are barren. And we shouldn't make the assumption that just because someone is in a quiet place, that's a good thing for them, because it might not be at all.
Well, that's fascinating that Julian touched on something we've already been talking about silence of people who don't have a voice or are given that. But I want to talk, because he also talked about different kinds of silences. And I listened to your Desert Island discs, and it made me laugh. So I think Kirsty Young was basically wondering what was going on for some of the songs, because you said in that you hated silence, and you listened to quite often a lot of really raucous metal music when you're writing. So what was going on with your relationship with music and silence, Elif?
You know, the ancient Greeks had 6 different words for love, and I think we need new words for silence, because as Julian very eloquently pointed out, there are different types of silence. I don't like silence when I'm writing. I don't like it when I'm in a very tidy, neat, clinical space. Okay. That makes me quite nervous. I think I feel more comfortable amidst clutter and chaos. I don't mind working in a noisy cafe, so long as people are not directly speaking, referring to me. I don't mind that kind of sound or noise at all. But I love music, and I like music with high energy. Okay. People are a little bit surprised when I tell them that I'm a metalhead since my youth. You know, they don't expect maybe a middle-aged Turkish woman to be a metalhead, but that's my reality. I love subgenres of heavy metal, particularly industrial metal, melodic death metal. Okay. I love metalcore. So music with very, very high energy and contrasts, like gothic. Love it. Scandinavian. I love discovering new bands. And usually when I like a song, when a particular song speaks to me, I listen to it 70, 80, 90 times on a loop. Wow. One song? One song, okay. Again and again. And that's how I zoom in and zoom out. And then I'm in a different space. And that's a great energy when you're writing. I feel like for some authors that might be torture, but you're in the zone. Is it kind of like, is it to do with the energy, the high energy of it translates into how you're putting words on the page, or is it not quite as simple as that? I mean, in heavy metal, I think there are so many raw emotions. I like that. There's a clash of raw emotions. There's an honesty. So many people who love heavy metal are actually gentle souls. Yeah, I've met many musicians. Some maybe subgenres of this type of music can be a little bit not to my taste, not my cup of tea. But other than that, I find it very energizing. Like there's this British band actually that I'm listening to a lot these days. It's called Sleep Token. Okay. And they do marvelous stuff. Do have a listen. I'll check them out. I've got a bit of a metal past myself. That's why I brought it up. Okay. Amazing. But one of the things I think is really interesting about writing to music, I kind of listen to, it's very common, I think a lot of writers listen to slightly ambient stuff, soundtracks, neoclassical, but the stuff I listen to is kind of slightly unsettling. I'm listening to the Severance soundtrack at the moment, which is just a little bit odd. But there's something inexplicable about music. It cuts right to your heart, doesn't it? It can make you cry or make you laugh without you consciously realizing what it is that's doing that. Absolutely. And actually you take that energy and you turn it into something completely different. So while you're listening to this music, you can do something that is very calm. I mean, people tell me that my writing is calm. Yeah. I hope so. But it's thanks to this music that I'm listening to, because there's such high energy in there, and I find that very, very transformative. So do you recommend that readers of your book should be listening to death metal? It's so interesting. Some of my readers have made soundtracks to my novels. Okay. And, they have either downloaded the songs that were mentioned throughout the novel, or they have come up with their own suggestions, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I get that quite a lot because I've written about music quite a lot in my novels, and quite often there's like playlists online, and it adds another dimension. It's a kind of it's an intersectional kind of thing where people can listen to the music while they're reading the books. It's fascinating.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but it's been really lovely, Elif, to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming in, Elif Shafak.
No, I'm so grateful. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.